People say that there's two things you should never discuss unless you want to get into an argument. And that's religion and politics. Well, today, we're going to talk about both, all right? We're going to talk about the role of politics and government in religion or in missions, okay? How does this relate to missions? I'll give you the short answer. This relates to missions because the goal of missions is for every people on earth to acknowledge God as king, all right? So there's a political element to missions, isn't there, right? And the question is, where do human governments fit into this? Where do human politics figure into this? Sure, God has given us the ability to govern ourselves. He has. We don't live in a theocracy today. There are things. God has. Remember, we talked about the cultural mandates and how God has given us dominion, right? Not domination, but dominion. So we're little L lords of this earth, right? So it's not like government is wrong. But, Jesus also said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's, right? So how does our human governance fit into God's rule over this earth? So that's a big question, all right? Now here, let me ask you this question. Does Christian equal conservative? Anybody? What do you think? No? Why not? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Conservative is a bit of a relative term. Conservative means to keep things as they are, right? To keep the status quo. And you know what? Sometimes it's good to keep the status quo, and sometimes it's really bad to keep the status quo. Because unless you think that our world is perfect as it is, there's probably some changes that need to be made, right? Now, I don't know anybody who thinks the world is perfect as it is. So if you think that there are some changes to be made, that need to be made, then we're not conservative in those regards, are we? But sometimes the things that change are not good changes. That actually go against God's law, go against God's rule. Those things, in those areas, we shouldn't be conservative, right? Big news today, right? Today is the day that the Pope resigned, Pope Benedict XVI. And now there will be this conclave of cardinals, and by the end of March, they should have a new Pope, all right, elected. And I hear a lot of people saying, well, is the new Pope going to be from Latin America? Is the new Pope going to be from Africa? But some people I've even heard say, I don't care, as long as the new Pope is conservative, right? And, I sometimes worry about that because I think, well, what does that mean to be conservative, right? Some things of the Catholic Church, yeah, I think should be kept conservative. I don't think we want to see the ordination of homosexual clergy, for example, or we don't want to see people becoming amenable to abortion or something, right? But perhaps in Catholicism, conservative could mean, let's keep the veneration of Mary, let's keep the veneration of the saints, let's keep, transubstantiation, or all these like staunch Catholic doctrines, which I don't necessarily agree with, right? And in fact, for those of you who are familiar, one of the greatest reformings of the Catholic Church happened in the 1950s with Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. And they did a lot of things that changed the Catholic Church. They said, oh, we don't need to do Mass in Latin anymore. We can do Mass in the local vernacular language. And some people said, oh, that's liberal. I think that's good, right? So I think to keep it conservative, which is to keep everything in Latin, it's not necessarily the best thing, right? Catholics used to say that Protestants aren't even Christians. And now, well, in their generosity, they call us separated brethren, right? Okay, well, I'll take that, if that's what they have to give. And I'm like, well, that's sure better than being a heretic, right, or a non-Christian in their estimation. So And some people cry foul and say, no, that's the Catholic Church liberalizing, right? And I think that's a good liberalizing, if that is liberalizing, right? So I don't necessarily think we want to keep that conservative. So, and even in the evangelical church, there are some things which I want to keep conservative, and some things which I really hope change, right? So I think when people, but so often I think, especially in Western evangelicalism, we equate these two. Christian equals conservative. I don't know that necessarily holds to be true. And plus, the definition of conservative changes over time. Right? Here, let me point out something. If you are an American Protestant, consider this. Your identity is founded on two radical anti-establishment protest movements. All right? Which ones are these? The American Revolution and the Protestant Reformation. Certainly at the time, not considered conservative. At the time, if you were conservative, you would be for the British monarchy, or you would be for the Catholic Church. But if you followed George Washington or Martin Luther, you were considered a revolutionary, right? And in fact, if these people had actually lost their movements, or think about the founding fathers of the United States, if they had lost the war, they would have all been hanged for treason. That's how bad their anti-conservatism was, right? So, and it's funny that we think of Protestant, American, whatever, as being conservative, but it wasn't always so, right? What was radical at one time is now conservative. Things change over time, right? When we talked about the songs, Martin Luther, he broke out from the Catholic Church. And then he wanted people to sing songs kind of that were familiar to them, right? He wanted the Bible in their language, in the vernacular. He wanted songs that were familiar to the people. What did he do? He took pub drinking songs. So, and he put Christian words to them, like "A mighty fortress is our God." Right? And today we think back to those and we're, oh, this is a great conservative hymn. But at the time it was a pub drinking song, and the Catholics thought Martin Luther was off his rocker, right? I mean, this guy is singing pub drinking songs in church, right? So again, the definition of conservative changes over time, right? What about this? Slavery, right? Back in the Civil War, the conservative thing was to keep slavery. Today, we think that's a really bad thing. So if you're against slavery, you're not conservative, right? To keep things the same was, to keep the southern plantations working with the whole slave force. So, and even Jesus was radical compared to the Pharisees, who were the conservatives of his time. Jesus was so radical that he was crucified on a cross. He certainly was not a conservative, okay? At least not according to the standards of the time. So I think, when we think about conservative, that means keeping the status quo. Liberal is changing the status quo. And I think we need to test everything according to Scripture to see whether or not keeping the status quo is actually good or not, right? Right? So I just talked about this. South was the conservatives, north was the liberals during the Civil War. Jim Wallace, who is part of the Sojourners community, he wrote a book called, during the 2000 Bush-Gore election, and it was called God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Just Doesn't Get It. And I kind of like this subtitle, because he essentially was saying, the right gets it wrong because it somehow equates Christian with being Republican. And the left doesn't get it because it thinks that Christianity needs to be eradicated from the public sphere. Okay? He says, religion is always personal, but it's never private. I think that's an important distinction. A lot of liberals think, oh, you need to get religion out of the public sphere because it's a private matter. And he says, no, it's a personal matter. It is never a private matter. To eradicate religion from the public sphere is lack of freedom of speech. Is lack of freedom of religion. These are the very things that our founding fathers fought for in America, right? And you know what? I want to exercise this. If you live in America, you can say what you believe. You can practice your faith. You do not have to hide behind closed doors. You do not have to not express your faith for fear of offending someone, right? Now, there is a fine line between offending someone and having free speech, okay? Because clearly, there's a lot of things you could say that could be very offensive, and I think that's where it crosses the line. But overall, I think, this tension between free speech and freedom, free speech and tolerance, right, is what this is a very important thing that America is founded on. We have to respect the rights of others, and yet we can say what we believe, right? And but I think that's an important tension to hold. If you've ever been to Washington D.C., the mall, right? What am I talking about? I'm not talking about a shopping mall, right? What's the mall in Washington D.C.? Yeah, it's that long, green, grassy stretch between the Capitol building and the Lincoln Memorial, with the Washington Memorial right in the middle, right? And the two streets that run alongside the mall, anyone know what they're called? One is called Independence Avenue, and one is called Constitution Avenue. Why? Freedom and law, right? These are the two things that need to be kept in tension, and the founders of America recognized this, right? So they wrote the Declaration of Independence, and they wrote the Constitution, freedom and law. And I think these are, so of course we need to have freedom. We can say what we want, but to a degree. There needs to be a civility, a respect, and a limit to what we can say. But in that civility and respect, it doesn't mean we shut down religion, does it? Right? It means you still have freedom of speech. People can say what they want to say, or what they want to believe. So, and I think we also do social justice, right? Because in this respect, we're not conservative. We do social justice because we believe certain things need to change, right? And so with regard to that, there's no conservatism, right? So I think the opposite of liberalism is not conservatism, but biblicism. I think we need to test everything by the Bible. Some things in our society, we're doing well by the standards of the Bible. Some things in our society, we're doing poorly by the standards of the Bible. And I think whatever you want to do, test it to Scripture and see if we need to remain conservative or liberal on a particular point. And I think that's the litmus test, and not this vague word called liberalism, which, what does that mean, right? I can think of a lot of people throughout history that were quote-unquote liberal, or actually were doing a lot of good. And a lot of people who were quote-unquote conservative were doing bad, but also vice versa, right? So what is biblical is the most important thing, okay? Now, does Christian equal Republican? Let me ask you this. Anybody?
No.
Why?
There is more to a Republican than just saying like being against abortion or gay marriage. There's a lot of like more logistical things that are not necessarily Christian or non-Christian.
Okay.
And some things I think Democrats believe are more Christian.
All right. So yeah, certainly. I think if you boiled down republicanism to a couple of issues, then maybe you might think this is true. But political parties are loaded with a lot of various issues. And I think in some respects, Republicans are more Christian, and in some respects, Democrats are more Christian. In the year 2000, there was I wasn't here, but people told me like there were banners across campus saying for the election, "This is Bush country," right? And how things have changed, right? By 2008, a lot of evangelical Christians were actually voting for Obama. So the landscape has definitely shifted. I think at one point, people thought this was true, Christian equals Republican. But I think things have changed. Some people think for the better, some people think for the worse. But I think, here's what I always ask. What political party do you belong to if you're pro-traditional marriage, you're pro-life, you're pro-creation care, you're pro-helping the poor, you're anti-war? Okay? See, of course Christians fall in a wide spectrum of beliefs, but the above, holding all five of those, does not seem to be unreasonable for a Christian to hold. I actually know a lot of Christians who hold all 5 of those. Okay, that's not a combination which seems to be jarring to a lot of people today. If that's the case, what political party do you belong to? Right? The first 2 seem to be suggesting Republican. The last 2 seem to be suggesting Democrat. The middle one, I don't know, maybe more Democrat, but some Republicans believe that too. I mean, when you say Republican and Democrat, the problem is people have this, they think of it as a combo deal mentality, right? We tend to think that Christian equals Republican because Republican equals pro-life. But if you're pro-life, you probably also support, the war on terror, or, and then people just start lumping. Well, if you're this, then if you're A, you must be B. If you're B, you must be C. If you're C, you must be D. And then they lump all of these together. But then it doesn't hold that if you're D, then you're also A, right? But then people think that because they start linking these things together. And I think instead of thinking of, the problem with political parties is that they lump all these things together. And in this combo deal, I think there's some things in the combo that I like and some things in the combo I don't like. I'd rather go a la carte, okay? And say, well, I like this about this and I like this about this. The problem is, how do you vote then? It's really difficult because in every combo, there's going to be some things you like and some things you dislike. So I personally am not registered for any political party. I vote for whichever candidate I think is best. But every time I vote, part of me cringes a little bit because I'm like, I realize by voting for this candidate, I'm also opening up the door for XYZ, which I dislike, even if I like ABC, right? The other disadvantage to not registering for a political party is you cannot vote in the primaries. So, and I think there's something good about that, okay? So, am I saying to do as I do? No. If you're registered for a political party, I think that's fine. You can vote for a primary. But I just ask that you be discerning when you vote and not just, I think a lot of people are mindless when they vote. They just vote for their party, no matter who the candidate is. I think you just need to take into consideration who the candidate is, okay? And I think, yeah, and part of this happened in the last election where a lot of evangelical Christians were voting for Mitt Romney. And I'm not saying it was bad to vote for Romney, but I think suddenly a lot of evangelicals were like, oh yeah, his Mormonism doesn't bother me because, and I think what was going on is their Republicanism trumped the Mormonism. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, that's fine if, maybe politics is not about religion. Maybe politics is about you find resonance with Romney's sort of moral stance on certain things. That's fine too. But all I'm saying is that it was interesting that after the last election, so many evangelical Christians are just like, yeah, Mormonism's cool, right? And I'm like, okay, well, is that because you really think it's cool, or is it because you equated Romney with the Republican Party and the Republican Party with Christianity, and therefore his Mormonism was okay by, sanction, right? So anyway, just to think about that. There was even a big thing about the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. They removed Mormonism from their website under their list of cults, right? It's like, and a lot of people were like, is that because Franklin Graham was trying to cozy up to Mitt Romney because they're both Republican, and I'm like, so they got a lot of criticism for this, and they're like, do you really think that, or you don't think they're a cult anymore, or are you just trying to, be nice to them because your politics trumps your religious convictions? So those are things to think about, right? Because when you have this lumping mentality, you put these things all together, I think it's, you can become unthinking. You just accept everything in this combo deal without thinking, well, what are the constituent parts of this, right? Okay, now abortion and homosexuality, Jennifer pointed this out, that these things, the problem with this is that these become the litmus test of what it means to be an evangelical Christian today, or at least for a lot of people. And I'm thinking, why is it the litmus test? Well, I think it's the litmus test in terms of politics. But then people make the leap from politics to religion, and then they start thinking that this is the litmus test in terms of whether or not you're really a Christian, right? And, not that I disagree with these things, but perhaps we're majoring on the minors here, right? If I ask you, what is the gospel? What is the heart of missions? What is the main message of Christianity? Would you actually mention these two things in your answer? I think I'd be hard-pressed to come up, I'd have to reach way down the bag before I finally come up with these things as of prime importance to what it means to be a Christian, or what it means to preach the gospel message, or what is the heart of the message of Christianity, right? But somehow, because of politics, these two have risen to the surface. These two become the primary two things that, and people use these as a litmus test to determine whether or not you're a Christian. And I wouldn't even put these two in the top 10 things that I would say are most important to the gospel. Okay? Now, some people may object, well, wait a minute, we're talking about murder here, right? Granted, right? But, honestly, still not in the top 10 things of what it means to be a Christian, right? I'm glad for people who fight these things, right? Who really have a heart to see these things changed. But maybe this, and I'm not saying you shouldn't if this is what your heart is, but perhaps overall as a whole church, we're a little bit too fixated on these two things, right? I think people are going to hell, and we reduce everything to these two things. Neither of which, by the way, Jesus ever talked about. Okay? Not that they're not important, but think about Jesus' message. All right? I think to be a Christian means you take up your cross and follow Jesus. Remember, we had that workshop where we did on the primary verb of the Great Commission is discipleship. Discipleship means you take up your cross and follow Jesus. More than anything else, this is what it means to be a Christian, right? David Kinnaman and Dave Lyons wrote a book called Unchristian, and they took the Barna research, which is kind of like they do polls of the church and Christianity, and they pointed out this from their research. They found that the major negative perceptions of secular people towards Christianity is that Christianity is anti-homosexual, that it is specifically contemptuous toward people that are gay and lesbian, the church is judgmental, that it is quick to find fault with other people, but not necessarily its own sinfulness, that it's too political, that it's too right-wing or too oriented around political objectives, the church is proselytizing or too focused on getting converts, that it's sheltered, and that it's hypocritical. The sheltered perception being that it is out of touch with reality, or it's boring, or it's old-fashioned. Okay. This is their findings of what the secular world believes of Christians. Now, some people may say, well, who cares what the world thinks, right? We're going to do what's right. You know what? The Bible says we need to care about what the world thinks. Paul in Philippians says, be blameless. So that you're shining like stars, in the darkness, so that nobody can say anything bad about you. Because when you have a blameless record, then you can be an effective witness, right? And now, let me qualify that. If people are saying bad things about you because you're Christian, that's fine, right? Jesus says people will say all sorts of things about you, and they'll criticize you, and they will persecute you, and he says, because of me. It's because of Jesus that people will do that to you. But I think a lot of evangelical Christians don't realize the difference between being criticized for Jesus versus being criticized for just being a jerk, right? And I think sometimes we're just jerks. And we need to, the things where we're going to have offense towards the world should be the gospel. The stumbling block to Jews, right? As Paul says in Romans. But not just because we're just offensive, right? And I think there's a difference there. And I think we need to, and these are some of the ways I think that we're just offensive, right? So I think this is one of the reasons I had you guys do the interview report. You go around and you interview people, and you find out, what do secular people think about Christians? And a lot of you expressed surprise, like, I did not know that this is what the perception was. Well, it's good for you to have done that exercise in that case, right? Because you realize, wow, I always thought people perceive me as this way, but they actually perceive me like this. And how you think that people perceive you will determine how you react towards them, right? So if you completely don't know how the secular world views you, then your gospel message will not be targeted in the right way towards them, will it, right? But when you understand, when you realize, oh, they're actually like this, or they're not as judgmental about this as I thought, but they're more concerned about this, then you can actually tailor your gospel message to something which is more effective in reaching them, right? So I think that's what's really important. Now let's talk about Billy Graham. The funny thing about Billy Graham is, we think of him as the primary evangelical spokesman, right? I mean, we were talking about the Pope. I think if people think if there's a Pope of evangelicalism, it's Billy Graham, right? In fact, I read a book about evangelicalism where the author says, he tries to list all these definitions of what it means to be evangelical. And he said that, and then he says, but there's also an intangible, which is that he found in his research that if somebody likes Billy Graham, they're probably an evangelical, right? It's just random. He's like this magnet, right? He's a figurehead. He's a symbol. But the funny thing about Billy Graham is he was liberal when he did evangelistic crusades with Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s. Before the 1950s, before the civil rights movement, whites and blacks did not mix. When Billy Graham came to the scene, he became a really prominent evangelist in 1949. And in the 50s, he started doing evangelistic crusades with MLK. And all the conservatives criticized Billy Graham. Said, why are you hanging out with a black man? You can't do this. And he says, the gospel is about reconciliation, right? He says, I'm going to do this. And, and I think about Jesus, right? How Jesus would do radical things like hanging out with sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, and all the conservative Pharisees would say, you can't do that. And Jesus says, I'm going to do it, right? The gospel is about breaking dividing walls. And you, in your protective, you can't go beyond these boundaries, conservatism, are all bothered by this. But the radical nature of Christianity is that it does break dividing walls. So Billy Graham was hanging out with Martin Luther King Jr. And they preached the gospel together. I think that was radical, right? He was not conservative in the early years. And it's funny because now he is considered conservative. But yet, he refuses to be a spokesman for Republicans or Democrats. You ask Billy Graham which one he is, he will deny both. He says the gospel is not about a political party. He was interviewed in Newsweek and he said this: Jesus did not have a political party. I am for morality, but morality goes beyond sex to human freedom and social justice. We as clergy know so very little to speak with authority on the Panama Canal. There's a lot of abuse going on there, or superiority of armaments. Evangelists cannot be closely identified with any particular party or person. We have to stand in the middle in order to preach to all people, right and left. I think in a way that has to be up to the individual as he feels led of the Lord. I think you have some, like communism or segregation, on which I think you have a responsibility to speak out, right? Certain social justice issues where people are being abused, he says, yeah, speak out on those. Communism, segregation. But he says, political party, he said, he noticed what, he's sort of quoting Paul here, being all things to all people so that by all possible means he might reach some. And so he has not been identified as or linked with the Republican Party. Billy Graham is not the Republican Party's spokesman. He's God's spokesman. And for him, it's not about politics. But because of this, he has been asked to be the political advisor to every president since Eisenhower, I think, right? I mean, that is incredible that he's had that kind of ministry to the most powerful person on the planet for 50, 60 years, right? I think that's amazing. And part of it is because he is able to be all things to all people. He's able to be a bit of a chameleon, right? And by chameleon, I don't think it means he's compromising, right? Some people may say, oh, he looks kind of slippery here, what does he really believe? No, he's being wise, right? I think he's being shrewd as a serpent, but innocent as a dove. The good thing about Billy Graham, he's in the twilight of his life. He no longer does public ministry because he has Parkinson's disease. But he has a spotless record. I mean, for someone of his prominence to have such a spotless record, he's blameless. I mean, no one can point to a scandal in which he's been involved in. I think that's absolutely incredible, right? The man has been a testimony for our Lord. And I think it's the reason why he's our spokesman. And he doesn't take sides. He says, look, I'm about Jesus' kingdom, not about American politics, right? And because of this, he can be the advisor to all these US presidents and influence them for good. All right? John Thune, how many of you know who this guy is? Anybody? All right, a couple of hands. Well, hey, he's a Republican senator from South Dakota. And guess what? He's a Biola graduate. He is probably the most prominent Biola graduate in politics today. And in fact, in the last election, people thought he was going to run for president. He's like fairly young, like handsome, but he's kind of like John Edwards except without the scandal, right? So, and people like him because he's squeaky clean, right? And in fact, John McCain was in the 2 elections ago was even thinking about potentially making him the running mate, right? And he was thinking he initially announced he was running for president in 2012, but he withdrew his nomination. But he may run for president in 2016, so we shall see. Okay, I think it'd be very interesting. Imagine a Biola graduate being president of the United States. I think that would be pretty cool. So, but if any of you are interested in getting involved in politics, the great thing about Biola is it's like a family, right? I think every time I go around the world and I meet someone who graduated from Biola, even though I don't know them, there's a sense of a kinship here, right? Like it's a small enough school that I feel the sense of kinship, and I think that's pretty cool. So anyway, watch this man's career and see where he goes. I think it'd be really interesting. And even if he doesn't become president, he has a lot of influence as a senator, right? So. Ron Sider is, actually, he is the head of an organization called Evangelicals for Social Action, okay? And for a while, like in the 1980s, people thought this guy was crazy because they said in the 80s, no evangelicals were doing social justice, right? But he was like, what are you talking about, right? Jesus did it all the time. This is biblical. And today, it's become more the norm. You have like International Justice Mission, and you have all these World Vision, and you have all these Christian organizations that are doing social justice. But Ron Sider was one of the pioneers. Okay, he has this great quote. He says, "We must be pro-life and pro-poor, pro-family and pro-creation care, pro-racial justice and pro-peacemaking. This completely pro-life agenda." Come back to this, but keep this in mind, completely pro-life agenda is now the official stance of both the Catholic bishops and the National Association of Evangelicals. And Evangelicals for Social Action believes in a completely pro-life agenda. That is, life does not begin at conception and end at birth. When millions die of starvation or diseases we know how to prevent, when millions die prematurely from smoking, when terrorism and war destroy innocent persons, the sanctity of human life is violated. But that broader, completely pro-life agenda does not mean we forget about abortion. And this is a balanced statement, right? Yeah, of course, we need to care about abortion, But he's saying we need to be completely pro-life. We need to do what the Republicans do and care about life before birth. But we need to do what the Democrats do and care about life after birth. Sometimes it feels like Republicans only care for life until the baby's born, then we don't really care about their welfare anymore, right? Then what do you do? But he's saying we care about life after birth, and that's called social justice, right? And so this completely pro-life thing is, it's saying there's not a mutual exclusivity to helping the poor and being anti-abortion, right? Both protect the sanctity of life. That all of life is precious no matter what stage you're in, right? And I think this is a good balanced viewpoint. It is a holistic pro-life approach, right? So, what is this? This is both and. It's not either or. I think mutual exclusivity is our problem. We think that if you believe in this, then you cannot believe in that. All right? If you're, and unfortunately, this is what our political parties have led us to believe, right? Because we've divided along those lines. Do you know that George Washington, when he was elected president of the United States, he initially declined because they wanted to make him king, okay? So he said, wait a minute, we just broke off from another king, also named George, by the way, and he says, you want to make me king of the United States? He said, no way. I'm going to be president. And then they said, well, we're going to have political parties. And he said, no way. He said, George Washington predicted this is going to split the United States in half, all right? Now, I think his concern was partially founded and partially not. It has not split the United States. We're still a union, all right? The Civil War, slavery split the United States in half, okay? But not political parties. But sometimes the vitriol that goes on seems to split us in half, okay? Maybe not in fact, but in spirit. Man, after the election, the 2012 election, I was watching my Twitter feed and the Facebook feed, and it was just like poison was spewing out of the mouths of both sides, Republicans and Democrats. And I have friends on both sides, and oh my goodness, I was like, Dr. Jekyll turned into Mr. Hyde, right? Everyone was like at their worst behavior and just almost calling each other like the Antichrist, for holding the other position. Now things settled down a lot more after the election, but on the eve of the election, it was just crazy, the vitriol that was spewing out of both sides. And so part of me thinks this is, and unfortunately, because of political parties, it's forced us to draw these lines in the sand and to say, oh, I belong to this, I don't belong to that. And whereas oftentimes these things are not mutually exclusive, right? These things are not like against the other side. You can hold both at the same time. You can be anti-abortion while being pro-social justice, right? There's no contradiction there. In fact, they go quite well together in this holistic pro-life approach, right? James says, this is probably, I don't know, if I have one favorite verse in the Bible, James 1:27 it might be it. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. What's going on here? It's both social justice and personal holiness. Social justice, which seems to be the realm of Democrats, and personal holiness or moralism, which seems to be the purview of Republicans. But James calls us to both. And he says, this is what pleases God. You need both of these. One versus the other is not right. These two totally can go together. There's no contradiction here. Latino evangelicals, and I have real heart for Latin America, and I have a lot of friends from the Latino world, and they call this Misión Integral, translated as holistic mission. And they say, And you people up in North America, you're always dividing between these things. And they hold these things together. The evangelicals, they say, there's no contradiction between them. And for evangelicals, this is kind of a recent awakening, Like in the 90s or in the year 2000, in the 2000s, we're starting to wake up to this fact. And Latinos have been saying this since the 1950s and 60s, So they were way ahead of the curve, and only now we're starting to listen to our brothers and sisters south of the border. And I think we always think we have something to teach them, but they have something to teach us too. And if we had only paid attention and listened, right, a little more closely. Actually, one more thing I want to point out is William Wilberforce, right? The famous MP, a member of Parliament from England, who abolished the slave trade. He actually had a famous quote. He said, "I have two great passions in life: the reformation of manners and the abolition of the slave trade." Right? What does he mean by this? Reformation of manners is an old-fashioned way of saying reforming morals. Okay? Because in the Victorian era, people were very lax in their morals. They may have seemed very upright on the outside, but on the inside they were not. There was a lot of corruption, there was a lot of sexual scandal, there was a lot of stuff going on. And Wilberforce recognized this, and he said, this is a shame, and we need to work to change this. He's far more famous for being the abolitionist of the slave trade. But he said, my two great passions in life are the reformation of manners and the abolition of the slave trade. So I think of this, right? Social justice and personal purity. He was working towards both. Also, those of you who may not know, William Wilberforce actually was the founder of the Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So it was logical. He had a compassion on anybody who was suffering or any part of creation that was hurting. He cared about abolishing the slave trade, but he also cared about animal cruelty, right? So, and today, a lot of times we lump anybody who cares about animal cruelty with PETA, right? Or radical groups that sort of bomb animal testing labs and things like that, right? But William Wilberforce, the SPCA, that was his brainchild, and he said, we need to treat creation well, because anybody who's weak, anybody who's suffering, anybody who's powerless, that's where he had the heart for, right? So it makes sense that he would care about animals, he would care about humans who are treated like animals, were treated without dignity. I mean, this was something which was really on his heart. So, but that's holistic mission, right? Wilberforce was kind of one of the pioneers or early representatives of what it meant to truly be an evangelical. Okay, now I'm going to show you this graph is the political economic axis. Now, the reason I pull this up is because I think a lot of people think of politics on a straight line. They don't think about it as a two-dimensional quadrant, okay? They think about it very one-dimensionally. And because you always hear the phrases left and right. Left is liberal, right is democracy, or conservative. But then we equate those things. We equate left with, in politics, with communist or socialist. We equate right with democracy and capitalism. Now, here's the interesting thing. Democracy and capitalism are clearly different words, because one represents a political meaning, that's democracy, and one has an economic meaning, that's capitalism. Well, what about communism? The problem is there's only one word, but it has two different meanings. There's the political sense of communism, and there's the democratic sense of communism, right? So you put these on an axis, and you get 4 different quadrants. There are some countries which are politically communist but economically capitalist, and they would go in quadrant 1. Some countries are economically capitalist but politically a democracy, and they would go in quadrant 2. Some are politically and economically communist, they would go in quadrant 3. and some are economically communist but politically democracy. They go in quadrant 4, okay? And I think this is a much more sophisticated way to think about politics and economics rather than just the left-right spectrum. Because then we start to mix up we start to mix up politics and economics. They're not the same thing, right? So let me ask you guys. Can you name a country which is in quadrant 1? Politically communist, but economically capitalist. China, great example. You go to China today, yeah, they're politically communist. People can't vote. They don't have freedom, a lot of freedoms. They don't have a lot of human rights. But boy, is it capitalist. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, I mean, Starbucks. There's a Starbucks in the Forbidden City now. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous, right? I was like, I can't believe it's there. So, but they're so capitalist. And this is one of the reasons why China is taking over the world economically today, right? But they're still communist politically, all right? So when people say China's communist, well, you're only talking about one form of communist, right? Okay? What about number 2? Who is economically capitalist and politically a democracy? This should be easy. The United States. Okay, right. What about 3? Who is politically communist and economically communist? What's that? Cuba, yes. I think I also heard someone say North Korea. That's true. Both Cuba and North Korea would fall in quadrant number 3. And who, this is a little bit of a harder one, I think. Is there anybody who is politically a democracy but economically communist? Or maybe we shouldn't say communist. Let's put a lighter form of communist. How about socialist? Canada. Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, yeah, Denmark, Northern Europe. Those would be politically democracies, but economically socialist, which is a light form of communism, yes. Can you give examples of why they fit that category? Sure, like their healthcare system, right? They have, like Obamacare, they've been doing that forever, right? They have socialized healthcare, right? They have socialized economics in terms of helping the poor. If anybody is jobless, they get a full pension, and they're taken care of. Yeah, so they're totally. So in a lot of these countries, there's no poor people because they just take care of them because of their economic socialism. Excuse me. Yeah. So you see all 4 of these types in this world, and I think it's important to distinguish between the economics and the politics. All right. Does Christianity equal capitalism? What do you think? Is there anything about capitalism which is Christian? I think last year I saw a poster on campus. We had a guest speaker come, and his topic was why capitalism is Christian. Did anybody attend that talk or remember that talk? I distinctly remember seeing that poster. Yeah. I didn't go, but that would have been interesting, I think, to see how. But I've heard people, Christians, trying to argue that capitalism is Christian. There's something very Christian about being capitalist. Well, I think communism is, in theory, a better system. Why? Well, let me qualify that. In theory. Communism says, let's take care of one another. Right? Let's distribute our resources so that no one is left behind. Let's try to help all the poor, those who are jobless. Let's try to help those who have no health care, give them health care. Everybody has a right to money. Everybody has a right to dignity. Everyone has a right to life. Everyone has a right to food. Everyone has a right to health care. We're going to take care of everybody. The early church, in many respects, resembled this. All the believers had everything in common, and they shared everything they had, and they gave to the poor. Right? Yes?
was voluntarily. I think communism, they don't give you a choice.
Okay, granted. That's a good point. That was voluntary. Communism doesn't give you a choice. But certainly, I think the early church resembles communism more than it resembles capitalism, right? I mean, I look at Acts 2, I don't see capitalism there at all, right? Now, it might have been voluntary, so in that respect it doesn't resemble communism, but in other respects it does sound very much like communism, okay? I said in theory, though. My big beef with communism, actually, before we get there, let's just talk about capitalism, for example. Capitalism is founded on greed and competition, right? If you've seen the movie Wall Street, Gordon Gekko says greed is good, right? He's the ultimate stereotype of capitalism. Because it's saying capitalism is basically a competition, right? Let's all go out there and let's rumble, right? It's every man for himself and see who comes out on top, right? Now, why do we accept this? Because that seems very almost Darwinistic, right? Like survival of the fittest. Why do we accept this? I think because we have the false impression that everybody has the same starting point and everybody has the same level of ability. Well, if everybody had the same starting point and the same level of ability, sure, capitalism would be totally ideal and it would work, right? Let's say you're going to have a race. Everyone starts at the same starting block and everyone has the same speed. Go, right? The problem is it's not a race like that. It's more akin to a race where you have some people starting a mile ahead of some other people. And you have some people who have a lame leg and cannot actually run, right? And then you say, go, and then the gun goes off. And then those who make it to the finish line are the winners. And if you watch this race, you would go, that's not even a fair race. But that is what capitalism is in the world today, right? But I think we think it's okay because we think that it all starts, that we all have the same ability and we all have the same starting point. It's actually absolutely untrue, all right? So here's the thing. Communism, my big beef with communism is it's idealistic, but it's not realistic. It doesn't take into account human sin. My big problem with communism is actually not the theory of communism, right? It's the reality of it. It sounds great on paper, but human beings are inherently sinful. When left to our own devices, we will be every man for himself. So, are we going to help others? Sometimes we do, but by and large we don't. And not only do we not help others, but when people say, hey, there's a system in place to help me if I'm going to be jobless or in bad health, then they take advantage of it. Then I won't work, right? Because I know I'm going to get a stipend anyway. So that breeds laziness. Oh, you know what? I'm not going to take care of my health. I'm going to keep eating junk food and then go to the doctor and demand to be fixed. Right? Human sin abuses the system. And that's why a lot of people protest Obamacare or any sort of socialized economy. Because they'll say, look, yeah, we think helping the poor is good, but these people are not poor, they're just lazy. They're taking advantage of the system. Yeah, okay, everyone should have a right to health, but these people are not unhealthy by nature, they're unhealthy by choice. They abuse the system. And all our taxpayer dollars are going towards people who are just eating junk food and then going to the hospital. Right? They're not exercising and then they're demanding to have surgery. So, human sin is the downfall of communism. Human sin is the problem why communism doesn't work. Right? Capitalism is realistic. It's much more pragmatic. Because you know what capitalism says? Capitalism says we realize that humans are screwed up. We realize that humans are greedy. We realize that humans are self-centered. But capitalism doesn't try to fix that. Capitalism says, you can't beat them, join them. Let's roll with the punches, right? Okay, humans are greedy and sinful. Let's make that the basis of our society. That's what capitalism is, essentially. Now, if I had to choose between these two, I would choose capitalism. Why? Not because I think it's Christian, but because I think it works better. I think it's the lesser of two evils. But I still think it's not ideal, right? But what can you do? Because under capitalism, you're going to have economic inequality. You're going to have rich and poor. You know? You're going to have 20% rich and 80% poor. Under communism, you're going to have one cruel dictator. And you may say, well, 20-80, that doesn't sound very good. Under communism, you're going to have 1% rich, 99% poor. Which is the better of the two evils? I take capitalism, right? But that doesn't mean capitalism is Christian. I think it's just, it rolls with the punches. Yes. Trent, did you have your hand? Or sorry, who's somebody up? Okay. All right. So, lest we jump into this bandwagon and think, oh, capitalism is wonderful, right? I think we need to be careful. So what does Republican and Democrat really mean? People think it's about abortion, they think about homosexuality, they think it's about racism, they think it's about social justice, they think about, you know what it's about? Ultimately, Republican equals small government, Democrat equals big government. That's what it boils down to. Republicans don't want people telling them what to do. Democrats want the government to control lots of different things, right? The Democrats have more of the Robin Hood mentality. Take from the rich and give to the poor. That's why poor people tend to be more in favor of the Democrats' side. The Republicans tend to be richer people who say, don't take from me, right? Don't tax me. I will voluntarily help the poor myself. So the Democrats say, we're going to have the government help the poor by taxing all the rich. And the Republicans say, don't tax me, I will voluntarily help the poor myself, okay? Now, interesting thing about this is these flipped after the Civil War. Republicans used to be big government and Democrats used to be small governments. Think about this. Who's the great hero of the Republican Party besides Ronald Reagan? It would be Abraham Lincoln. What did Abraham Lincoln do? He was for social justice. He was for abolishing slavery. He used big government to abolish slavery. Whenever people say, oh, I don't like big government, I don't like government doing social justice, I want to do it on my own, I say, how would you have abolished slavery without big government? It took the President of the United States, right, with the 13th Amendment to, I think it's the 13th, right, to abolish slavery, right? You could not have done that on your own. But after the Civil War, these flipped, and Republicans went from big government to small government, and Democrats went from small government to big government. Because Democrats used to be the rich ones. They used to be the rich southern plantation owners, and they did not want anyone touching that. So they said to the government, hands off, right? And the Republicans were not the rich ones, they were the poor ones, and they were fighting for abolition of slavery. But as soon as Republicans became rich and Democrats became poor, then Democrats were like, big government, and Republicans were like, small government, don't touch my money, right? So, and yeah. And so then Democrats started becoming more in favor of like helping the poor, helping ethnic minorities, helping the civil rights movement. So it became Lyndon B. Johnson against Richard Nixon, right? So Johnson was much more in favor of Civil Rights Act and Nixon was not, right? So now, I don't think big government or small government are more Christian than one another, even though people like to spin it as such, right? Here's the thing. Because of human sin makes poor people lazy, and they take advantage of the services of big governments. But human sin also makes rich people lazy, and they don't help the poor in small governments, right? So if you're really in favor of big government, you're going to help the poor via government, well, you're going to have, like in Sweden, you're going to have people who say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to work because government will give me a stipend. So I'm just going to remain jobless. And they leech off of society. But those who are in favor of small government and say, don't tell me what to do, don't tell me what to do with my money, don't take my money to help the poor, I'm going to help the poor myself. And then I go, okay, hands off. You help the poor yourself. And human sin means that most people don't. They don't. They keep the money for themselves. I'm not saying either big or small government is better. I'm just saying that human sin makes both difficult to operate. Human sin messes up both. Human sin will cause both to not work the way they should. Right? And that's unfortunate, I think. So rich people don't donate to the poor, and poor people take advantage of government handouts. And then it makes the rich people even more dig in their heels and say, you see, I don't want a big government because of the handouts. And but it's just human sin, no matter how you slice it, both ways. Great. Well, if Christianity does not equal capitalism, does Christianity equal democracy? I think this is a little bit of a harder question, right? Because now we're not talking about economics. Now we're talking about politics, like freedom, right? What do you think? Do you think that democracy and Christianity parallel or overlap? Anybody? Kristen?
Well, I think C.S. Lewis said something like, democracy is the best kind of form of government we can have because no man can have ultimate authority on earth because he's sinful and it will corrupt him. And so democracy is kind of like the best we can do for now.
Okay, so C.S. Lewis, democracy is the best we can do. Does that mean democracy is Christian, or does it mean that it's the least of all the evils that we have? The least of all the evils. So you kind of regard it as sort of like capitalism. It's like, it's not good, but it's the best that we can do on this side of heaven. Okay? Anybody else? Does anyone else have another opinion, or what do you think? How Christian is democracy? All right, well, here's the thing. When we're talking about missions, especially, or especially politics, but in missions on the Christian side, should we export democracy to every country in the world? Is democracy the best form of government for everyone? We think, it's the rule of the people. Isn't that great? I mean, is there something about democracy which is not right for everybody? Shouldn't everyone have self-rule, self-governance? Well, democracy is predicated upon an educated populace. It is, right? If a country is not educated, I'd be very afraid of democracy. Because you put the rule into the hands of the people, and the people have no idea what to think. Would you have children rule a country? No, because they're not educated, all right? In the same way, people without education, to expect them to self-rule, no way. And unfortunately, even in the United States, which supposedly is very educated, I talked to some people, oh, so why did you vote for that candidate? Maybe not the president. People have an understanding of the presidential candidates. But like local congressman or something, or a certain proposition, why'd you vote on that? I don't know. I like the sound of it better. I like that person's name better, right? People literally vote like that. And I'm like, that's frightening, right? For me, if I don't know anything about a proposition, I leave it blank. Because I don't want to vote on something that I don't know anything about. Otherwise, you just random, willy-nilly just vote on something, right? Education is necessary. And so I feel like democracy should only be in countries which have education as a high priority. That they know all the issues of what's going on, right? Evangelicalism, some of the things that define evangelicalism are the priesthood of all believers and the primacy of the Bible. But in order to do this, this assumes literacy for everyone so that they can read the one true authority, which is the Bible, right? The reason why the Catholic Church has been the way it has been in terms of priest control for so long is because people were illiterate. They were uneducated. They could not read the Bible for themselves. And if that's the case, then okay, have the priest tell you what to believe, right? But if that's not the case, if people can actually read the Bible for themselves, let them. And don't just have someone else tell them what to believe, okay? So I think there's a lot of places in this world which democracy would not be a good idea for them. Yeah, but some places need democracy, all right? So should Christians get involved in politics? Separation of church and state is, I think, one of the things that makes our country, that defines our country, right? So does that mean Christians shouldn't get involved in politics? Actually, no. I think that Christians should get involved in politics. I think people like John Thune and whatever. But there's a difference between being involved in politics versus being overly political, right? And I think you can definitely let politics become an idol. Bartolome de las Casas was the William Wilberforce of Latin America. And he used his high position in the Catholic Church to abolish the slavery of Native Americans in South America. So yes, people like William Wilberforce and Bartolome de las Casas, they were involved in politics, right? Charles Finney also used the abolition movement as one of his platforms. He would use the altar call to recruit people for abolitionism, right? So let me just give you a couple of verses about Christianity and government. I already talked about this. Jesus, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's. But Peter says, be subject to every human institution, right? Whether it be the emperor or governors, because this is the will of God. Again, be blameless, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. But also we have to keep in mind, though the Bible says, yeah, you should obey human authority, we need to know when human authority needs to be opposed. The Nazi Party or segregation in South Africa or in the American South or whatnot, right? So just following the law is not always the most Christian thing. You need to know when to oppose the law righteously, right? Romans 13, Paul also says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Also in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul says, don't have lawsuits against each other. This is not Christian, all right? Let me just, so what are some of the missional implications? Let me just end with this. When is it okay to break the law? I think when the law is unjust, right? So slavery, poverty, exploitation, racism, whatnot. Missions in restricted access countries. Yeah, if the country outlaws Christianity, I think it behooves us to do missions there still. You can break the law with a clean conscience, right? So I just feel like these are some of the things to keep in mind when you're discussing politics and how it relates to missions. But I think rather than just simply saying, oh yeah, keeping to the law is what we should always do, or being conservative is what we should always do, I think we need to discern when breaking the law is actually correct and when being non-conservative is actually appropriate. Thanks, guys. I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.